to me. There are two possible ways to live your mental life, and each way is unacceptable to one segment of humanity. The first way is to live it with no unnecessary effort, and the second is to live it in an effortless daze. The first is unacceptable to ordinary men, and the second to the curious few. The ordinary can hear no words of wisdom, lest they seem laced with criticism. There was once some creatures who had a unique currency, which, although backed on There was once some creatures who had a unique currency, which, although backed up by nothing of material value, made them the dominant force of their world. And as their trafficking in and dependence on the currency grew, they began to speak of it in increasingly complex terms and to treat it as though it did have intrinsic worth, since, should anyone ever remember and note that the entire system was based on an illusion, the structure would collapse and bring to an end their wondrous adventure and reign. I don't know. I'm probably speaking out of turn. I just feel like that is, what do you call it? Probably metaphorical. I mean, a lot I know, but if you feel that the prevailing current public problems are also your problem, then you have more problems than you've ever imagined. So pondered one man. If there is a specific, valid basis behind man's concept of religion, then why are there many and not just the one? Then answered his own question by suddenly realizing that every person who discovers the secret and says anything about it publicly, perforce produces yet another apparent new religion. Once upon a time, a man found an amazing cap which he put on, and which changed everything in his head and beyond. And he quickly became accustomed to the new situation and forgot all about the cap. Critics of propaganda warn, repeat a lie to keep it alive. And a man's mind said, don't listen to them. Your thoughts, prompted by the thoughts of others, can hardly be called yours, now can they? One man lived with a booger bear, but couldn't seem to leave, in part because the damn bear kept offering to help him move. One man sang to himself. He sang every song he knew, every song he'd ever heard, and every one he'd ever imagined he had heard. He became so good at it that he decided to turn the whole thing into an act which he named A Man and His Mind. You waste your time and drop your pants whenever you criticize what takes place in the everyday verbal arena as not being sufficiently serious, pertinent, or useful. It's not intended to be. There's no way it can be. Aren't you beginning to get it? One day, that man I mentioned previously once more went a-pondering. If there is a valid authenticity to the idea of the mystical, then why is there not but a single form of it instead of many? But he should have realized that there is. Farmers with their own livestock total out of control will be delighted to assist you in taming yours. Down, Hoggy, down. To accuse an ordinary man's mind of being partisan is to accuse him of breathing. Funny is not the same as pathetic, unless it's played out in the routine realm. There was once a sailor who spent his life exploring all of the wondrous and exotic seas the world had to offer. Then one day found himself shipwrecked, alone on a barren island, and it was there, with nothing but himself, that he made his final grand discovery. A quiz game between two men. What's the world's biggest waste of time? You mean besides being impressed by anyone else? I forget it. Entertainment. Different men's, different tastes. The simple enjoy crime and gore, the weak religion and art, while those with a personal acquaintanceship with life directly like whatever life likes. And a certain song grew louder. Oh, you can't get away, there's no place to get away to, but with a short mind, you can sure believe otherwise. There are three possible approaches to trying to learn something, even something extraordinary. And each one has a predictable outcome. First, you listen to others, which is guaranteed to result in nothing. Second, you can listen to a mystic, and if you know how to listen, this can be of assistance. And third, you can try and listen to life speak directly through your genes, succeeding in which then leaves all questions of success 40 miles past irrelevant. Once upon a time, a man captured a wondrous creature and put it in a box. But the creature was so wondrous that it never realized it was in a box. And soon, somehow, even made the man forget. Another question and answer game between two men. What's the one thing in the world that, guaranteed, if you keep talking to yourself about it, you'll never be able to do it? And the second guy said this one was too easy to even respond to. Another history of man. When men began to believe that they were too hip to think of nature as being alive, they breathed into existence the gods. And after they started believing that they were too sophisticated to any longer think in terms of gods, they came up with the notion of each man's individual psyche, which, even as likewise limited and unfulfilling as it is, seems to be about where things stand today. But the few should note that the problem lies not with what man specifically believes, but in the fact that he believes at all. And even that is assuming there is a problem. Daddy, the more I think about this whole activity of trying to expand your own awareness, the more it seems possible that only those so involved have any problem with life. And as Papa noted, that curious nod that signifies one's understanding of things most curious. There was once a man who had an illness. It wasn't fatal. It didn't even incapacitate him. In fact, it helped facilitate the living of his everyday life. You got to admit, that's some kind of illness. Witticism, correction. History is not the lies that survive. The truth is. If ordinary thought was a hole in a boat, there's no way a man's mind could ever figure out how to patch it. Daddy, is that why you never see the more conscious playing piggyback? Once upon a time, a man found himself in possession of a great herd of unknown, marvelous beasts, and in following their movements, he was taken to new and exciting places. And before he was aware of it, he merged with the herd and could no longer observe it as an objective outsider. Once upon a time, a man found himself in possession of a great herd of unknown, marvelous beasts, and in following their movements, he was taken to new and exciting places. And before he was aware of it, he began to have favorites within the herd. And soon their wondrous travels ceased. Until you realize what the actual purpose of thinking is, you can never rise above it. The mystical is like a bridge always between now and the future. Far beyond the simplistic material religious interpretations of it remains the fact that poverty does equal freedom, but not merely in stripping oneself of useless possessions, but of useless thought as well. Why fiction's non-operative with the more knowing? Nothing man can make up is as fantastic as life as it is. Once upon a time, a man who had been struggling for the greater understanding suddenly fell into it, and in so doing, discovered a view of reality as large as the universe itself. So large, in fact, that it seemed impossible to hold in his mind. So he further increased his understanding and made the secret shrink to a size he could carry in his pocket. If you don't realize that man lives in a closed system, nothing makes sense. But if you do, everything does. In terms of pastries, you could think of the secret, were it to be described, as coming in two varieties. The fancy, powdered, embellished, sugared, and stacked high kind, and then the plain. One man's attitude toward the living of one's own life he expressed thusly: I don't take advice, and I damn sure don't give any. Conclusion: you either know what you're doing or you don't. And finally, another in our continuing series of, so what's the problem? If the secret were any simpler, it wouldn't even be a secret. So what's the problem? And good night. A little piece from last time, and in case anyone thinks that the people writing this program are losing touch with reality and becoming senile, I'll point out to you again that there is the secret. And after the secret, everything else is just talking around and around in circles. And what we were talking about last time, if you recall, was me trying to get you to consider the fact that what would seem to be obvious even to those with metaphysical interest, and even after my verbal support or verbal presentation of the kind of historical description of why people have always, or why certain people have always spoken in allegories and parables, and it being that they're simply the great secret or the enlightenment and everything, the Christ consciousness or whatever it is, that once it's seen, people realize, well, there's no way to describe it, and therefore they do their best. They do their best, they come right back and they go, well, let me put it to you this way. There was a man who owned a kumquat vinery. Winery? And he had 3 sons. Well, I'm trying to change from last time because I hate to keep beating the same parables in the ground. Man owned a cucumber winery and he had 4 sons. But you recall where we were, I was pointing out the possibility, at least, that is damn near, possibly, the exact operative reality of what is actually going on. That it's not simply that the secret of what's going on in life, that somebody sees it and they go, well, this is absolutely too unbelievable, and therefore I'll make up a fairly mundane parable. That I'll make up something about a farmer. For years, that's the one uses when I pulled out the kumquat thing. Jesus, Buddha, everybody. It's always a simple man, a humble farmer, an humble coal miner. And then they go into the store using everyday ideas and pictures to try and make that which is so bizarre, so fantastic, so unbelievable, so otherworldly, to somehow drag this just astounding, miraculous, marvelous kind of knowledge into something that almost makes sense in an everyday way. I mean, it sounds so good. It sounds like that they're trying so hard, and it sounds like both a mystical and a rhetorical, a linguistic, if you're not mystically inclined, explanation of the origins and the purpose of parables and allegories. That there are things that cannot be said directly, and they must be said obliquely. What if that's exactly backwards? That is, that the things that are the reality, supposedly, behind the real metaphors, the honored, remembered metaphors and allegories and parables, that the reality, what gave them their origins, was so fantastic, what the people saw, that there's no way you could make an ordinary person listen to it. It's just, well, I'll do with that. And so they have to come up with some fairly routine story, parable, to explain it. That sounds as though that is just beyond any question except it could be the absolute opposite of that. And so I never did get around to giving any codified punchline last time, so I could just simply point out to you that there are I wonder who hedges more around certain things than a hedgehog or a mystic trying to trick people. So I was going to start all this suggesting, and it might be. How about this? There's no allegory, there's no parable that you can make up that is as fantastic as seeing what's going on. Now, surely some of you put together that was just what I did not put in those direct words last time. But in other words, not that the thing is so fantastic, so unbelievable, that men have to drag it somewhere back to ordinary, everyday reality, says a Buddha, a Muhammad, a somebody, that, now that I've seen it, now what will I do with it? How will I ever explain anything this fantastic? And for thousands of years, right up until today, people, those who believe they're interested in such things, that's an accepted fact. I mean, it's more than a fact, it's just a pillar of the whole mystical community, all New Age efforts, even if it was old age. It's all based upon that they're just things that are so fantastic, which is one of the apparent purposes of the mediums, the channels, priests, that all this is so fantastic. I'm not going to continue to chop it up into every possible example, but there's enough of them that you should have a kind of overall feel for what prompts this, that in every religion, every part of this planet, and every culture has been the idea that there's a need for priests, that there is a kind of power, information, force, brilliance from the center of the universe, from God, from the Creator, from the secret, that is such that ordinary man, we simply can't take it. It would blind you. And there's stories all the way from Greek mythology to Christian parables. And things that are apocryphal, I suggest, history is within the Old Testament. And all it is saying, well, there are things that men get blinded, and they must have an intermediary. And at the crudest, simple level, ordinary people like the idea that somebody else will take up for me. That we got a priest, which is the same thing as a hero. There's somebody else will do the work for me. That's why you like heroes. That's why they like priests in a slightly shifted manner from it just being a hero in the sense of doing battle physically. Here's someone who is doing spiritual battle for you, that trying to bring the great message. At any rate, that is the basis of all of this, and that's the basis of also accepting beyond their physical appearance and necessity for a priest and interpreter, then for the priest or the interpreter to use allegories and parables, because the information that he goes off and he communes with the gods, and he gets this information in dreams or some sort of supernatural state, and then he comes back, but it's so astounding. I mean, he's always risking his life, and if you don't believe it, all you got to do is ask a priest or somebody, and they'll always go, oh, yeah, boy, you don't know what I've given, the price I've paid for my great understanding, which we've been through this. Any of you who are prone to be big-hearted and charitable to people, anybody that tells you the price they paid for their understanding, you can count on this immediately. You understand as much as they do, and probably more. Assuming you're not whining or waiting on your turn to whine back, but if you're not, they did not pay anything because they don't understand anything. That's what cost. For those of you that didn't like the one a few nights ago about a man asked life, it was representative of life. He asked him this kind of activity, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to struggle with this. Could you tell me now? I've been working on it, now maybe I'll continue, but what's going to be the actual cost of this? And the local rep said, well, and he gave him a figure, and the man, he knew something was wrong. He said, nah. He said, I don't want an estimate. I want the actual cost. And the representative said, well, in that kind of activity, it's all estimate. There is no cost. In case any of you think that I only use simple, obvious parables, work on that one again. It does make sense. Of course, that's easy for me to say since I wrote it. Who's going to prove otherwise? Pretty cheap criticism, I must say. But what if it is just the opposite? I'm going to move on, apparently. But that it's not that the information or the secret of life, the understanding of what life is, the enlightenment and all that, is so astounding that these people going back, as they try to describe it, and reuniting with God, some way running back down the genetic line in reverse and getting back in touch with the Big Bang. Of course, they call it seeing the light and being enlightened, talking to God. That is so fantastic, what they saw, that there is absolutely no way they could get anybody to understand it. So they have to come up with, there was an old man who owned a farm and had 4 sons. There's something we've got to bring it down to an everyday level and make some sort of parable out of it. What if it is just the opposite? Because tonight I pointed out in another way that the reason fiction is inoperative, is a non-functioning reality amongst those more conscious, is that men can't make up anything as fantastic as what's going on. No particular offense to novelists, but to hear somebody try to make up stuff, or to watch a movie and see people putting in their best little acting efforts, and somebody trying to write, and especially if they've got any sensation or intent of making an allegorical statement in science fiction or in something, and you see them just squeezing and trying their best. The actors doing it, and if you can look backwards, you see the little screenwriters. They were months or years ago squinching up and trying their best to come up with something. What can we have them do? What can we make up this week instead of a flying pig? What kind of people from other universes with strange powers? And they do their best. And again, as you know, I'm not criticizing, but it's, once you see what life's about, you're kind of hard pressed. It'd be like seeing Shakespeare performed by Orson Welles or what's his name, the dead man, before he was dead, Laurence Olivier. It'd be like seeing that, and then the rest of your life you're faced with a high school drama class. If you see what I mean. That's a crude comparison, but I say out. That once you see what life is, then seeing men try to make up something about how fantastic things might be. I mean, it's just our imagination. And you think, well, you poor things. You know, they're part of an imaginary story and don't know it. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. This is just a theory. Here's an idea. Here's a plot. Is this unbelievable enough? No. No, it's just child's play. But what if it is not that the thing about life, the secret of life, what's going on, it's not so fantastic that you can't tell anybody and it's unbelievable. What if it is just almost verbally the opposite? That you can certainly tell somebody. You can tell a child almost. I mean, somebody 8 or 10 years old, but nowadays you could tell them what's going on. You could tell them the secret of life. That wouldn't accomplish anything. I mean, what I want you to see is it does not take a vocabulary of any great extension. It does not take education. It doesn't take much. It doesn't take much of anything. It's just a few simple words, and you can say it. So what? It is too unbelievable. Now, that's not the word people would use. And if I went ahead and tried to, not try, there I go playing hedgehog. If I went ahead and in my own way put what life is, just the actual, everybody always wonders, the secret of life. If I just said, all right, here is a workable, a valid, here's a real description of it. And I could do it in just a few words. And if I did it to ordinary people, or even you, at your ordinary level, you would hear it. The sense makes perfect sense. Nothing strange. Has nothing to do with Atlantis. Nothing to do with God. Nothing to do with talking to the dead. Nothing to do with the tarot cards. Nothing to do with anything weird. It is so unweird that it's damn near weird. People go, no, it's too weird. And you would tell them, and the mind goes, it's just nothing. You go, well, no. So what's the purpose of parable and allegory? You see, you got to think fast, because at first you think, all right, now I know what you were saying, so, and then you think, no, I missed it. To put it crude, to use ordinary terminology, what people call the truth about life. The truth, life itself, is what's unbelievable. And I can give you proof of it. I can't prove it, but I can give you proof of it. Is that everybody on this planet, with any, just about everybody on this planet but now, one way or the other, has heard, even said in some way, and I don't mean that somebody told them purposefully, but in some way has heard the words put together that I, or anybody who understands what's going on, could accept the words. In other words, they have heard life described exactly as it is. I might point out, oftentimes, is a quasi-curse even. They've heard people, just common people, standing in a bar, some on a street corner, a stranger, and some little something happens, a bus hits a mud puddle, somebody goes by and waves just an ordinary occurrence, and a stranger can turn around and go, bah, 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 bah. And if you wrote that down and said, would you accept that as being a description of the secret of life? And I might go, well, that ain't bad. And they say, where'd you hear that? And you say, well, there's a guy who was down the street corner down there. Almost everybody on this planet has heard life, the secret, the purpose of life. They've heard what Buddha saw in enlightenment, what Moses saw when he reached the promised land, what Jesus saw in Christ consciousness, the whole thing that everybody has heard it described. Then the question is, so what? Nobody even notices it. No. There were, if I may, there were several, at the very least tonight. Would you like to listen again? Because they're about this, what we were just talking about. There was once some creatures who had a unique currency, which, although backed up by nothing of material value, and I assume you all understand enough about ordinary monetary systems, this currency was backed up by nothing of material value, but which still made them the dominant force on their world. And as their trafficking in and dependence on the currency grew, they began to speak of it increasingly, or in increasingly complex terms. The more they dealt with this currency that had no gold, they had no material wealth in reserve, which actually backed up and made the currency have some so-called material value to it. The more they dealt in it, which we're now describing their civilization, where they were, their dominance, their power began to expand, and as it did, the more they depended on it, they increasingly spoke of it in more and more complex terms and began to treat it as though it did have, just no question, intrinsic value. Because they realized that if anyone remembered and made note of the fact that the whole thing was based on an illusion, an illusionary concept, the whole structure would collapse and their reign would be over. Need I hint, since I believe I wrote it, it has absolutely nothing to do with money. It has damn near anything to do with the words on this paper. But see if look how long it takes up, a quarter of a page, third of a page. And all it is talking around the secret, chasing a hedgehog, putting on your little fur coat, dyeing its coat, making it run the other direction, trying to tell people listening, oh, that's not a hedgehog, that's a weasel. You just thought it was a hedgehog. And the next time you say, oh, no, that's a ferret. Or no, that's a beaver. And Jenny Craig, he's got all slimmed down. Well, may I ask you to consider some creature somewhere that had a currency, a singular currency. There were only creatures on the planet that had this currency. And it made them the dominant force, although the currency had no reserves. It was not based upon anything of material wealth. There was no gold, no platinum. There was nothing material, which in theory and supposedly in practice is, I assume you know, that paper money simply represents something of wealth, actually human sweat and labor. But then there's supposed to be then something that has some intrinsic value, such as gold, since men have decided that it does. But these people, the currency they had that made them the dominant force, they ruled their world, wherever this was. They ruled it by power, by virtue of having this currency, based on nothing of observable value. And then the more that they began to depend on it, they began speaking of it more and more, not just as a simple currency, it's not just a dollar bill or whatever it was. They began to speak of it in greater and greater, more complex terms. The structure itself became more and more of an intricate, rococo, embellished structure. They had to, because they realized, in quotation marks, they realized that if anybody, see, the more you talk about how complex it is and how all interlocking, how hard it is to fathom, and it's getting almost beyond the power of men to comprehend it. Well, such as the monetary system, since I use that is a fair example. Almost anybody, a physicist, mathematicians, even an economist, on a good day, will admit nobody understands economics. Even psychiatrists go, at least we're not, there's somebody worse off. They even say it. But then they let it go at that, because that's somewhat true of all the world of academia. But consider my story, because this is the heart of academia, because this is the heart of something else. We're not talking about money, remember. It's interesting it starts with them, but the more they depended on it, the more they had to treat it in an increasingly complex manner. They had to treat it more and more, or further and further removed from what it was originally. It's not insulting what it was. It's not to say, well, they made a mistake. It put them in control of the world, their world. But the more they were trafficking in it and depending upon it to keep control, the more they had to begin to speak of it and to add to it and to make this thing just bloom into a greater and greater complex and incomprehensible piece of machinery. Because they realized, in quotation marks, that if anybody ever remembers that the whole thing started off on an illusionary concept, it's obvious. It's going to go, pow! And hey, their day in the sun is finis. The great adventure, their reign is over. We're not speaking of a world somewhere. We're not speaking of money. Oh, we're speaking of a world somewhere, but may I say, instead of the circumference, well, let's just say of planet Earth, how about something more like, let's say something like that. I know that sounds like science fiction, but you got to understand there are different levels of worlds here and there. That you must treat it. They had to treat it. The more they depended upon this imaginary this currency, becomes real enough, because it kept them in control. But they had to keep adding to it. Does this sound like anything like a plain, unembellished little cookie of the secret? Yeah. And you go, well, okay. And so you go from there. You start off with this one plain cookie, piece of white bread. I'll change the parable in the middle of parables. Instead of currency, the people want to become the bakers of the universe. But they'll never get there. They got one piece of white bread, or one plain cookie, just a dough cookie. So they have to keep treating it. They begin adding to it. And you don't even have to add to it materially. They just all begin to talk about what they're going to do and how the cookie is not actually as plain as they thought originally. Or that's not actually white bread. I believe I see some flakes at least of rye in there, and that might be a raisin. There's some frosting. They have to keep doing that, at least somebody. It's like a few generations, it's like it goes so far that as you hope that no one remembers. Because if somebody finally remembers, and they point out that the king's not wearing any frosting. 3 parables at once. You got to admit, you get your money's worth. That some kid out there goes, wait a minute, that loaf of bread's naked. And everybody goes, if anybody remembers and makes note of the fact that here is this tremendously complex monetary structure, back to the original one, that now is the heart, it is the artifact under which these creatures exercise their domain over this planet through this currency, because no one else had it. If somebody finally one day went, do you realize our monetary system is naked? Does anybody remember this was based on something that we suddenly started digging with it, and there was no reserve, there was no Fort Knox, there was nothing backing it up? It'd be too late then. You can't take those words out of that kid's mouth when he says, look, the king's naked. You can't ever cram him back in his mouth. Because then everybody's heard it. They didn't want to. If anybody remembered and said, do you realize that this whole structure we've done, don't raise and we're in power, they could say it like a kid. They could say it innocently enough. Does anybody remember that this whole thing started thousands of years ago and it was built on an imaginary concept? It'd be too late. Before the bankers, before the priests, the rabbis, the politicians, all decent people, before they could holler, shut up! It'd go, wow. It sounds like a good story. They don't tell stories like this. If you would continue all of these, in a sense, are the same story from the great Hedgehog Book of Fables. Once upon a time, a man found an amazing cap. Not money, a cap, which he put on, and which changed everything in his head. But he quickly became accustomed to the new situation and forgot all about having the cap. One man lived with a booger bear, but couldn't seem to leave it, in part because the damn bear kept offering to help him pack up and move. I guess that's, if we were ordinary, somebody could say, I'll play the part. Boy, it's a good thing that, I could be talking to somebody that does stuff and say, boy, it's a good thing you do speak in parables, because they just, even the parables don't make sense. But if you tried to present that kind of thing as a straightforward fact, they could say to me, you be right. It's a good thing you're speaking in parables, because it just barely slips by. I know. I'll put it to you another way. How about this? Do you realize that there are writers right this second? I always have been. There are people at home right now sweating over a hot word processor, trying their best to come up with parables and allegories, because it's always been a sign, if you've got any sort of audience, potential audience, it's always been a sign of not just intelligence, but an intelligence with a certain spin, with a certain joie de vivre, a certain, at least minor brilliance, out of the ordinary brilliance. If you can just, in a 2,000-page novel, or in a lifetime, maybe come up with one parable that the critics, lit teachers in college seem to remember. It's just a real challenge. I put it to you another way. If you know what's going on, it's not a challenge. The challenge is you think, well, how could I set up a parable? Instead of other people sitting around, you understand, I'm not. Them thinking, all right, how can I start off from this everyday life? I got this man and woman, they met and they fell in love, and then they fell out of love, and his father's now being charged with embezzlement, and his mother has run off with a sailor on a tanker. All right, how can I take this and somebody turn it into, right there at the end of the chapter, maybe like a metaphor, and the critics and people notice and go, ooh, this story is not just about a love affair. And they're trying their best to find a way to get it into a parable. Contrary to that, I'm suggesting by my opening of pointing out to you that the truth, the reality itself, life itself may be such that the idea of what parables are used for could be in the opposite. Point is, those who have seen it just think they're not trying to slip into a parable. They think, all right, how can I start this as a parable and maybe trick people into getting right toward the end and almost go, look here! Ah! Did I muck it up too much again? In other words, instead of trying to take ordinary circumstances, which authors have always tried to do, and think, how could I turn this into a parable? Or some of them even feel like, wait a minute, there's almost a parable in me. God, I wish I was JB and it had to come out. If I can just get it out, if I can just put it right, it'll really be impressive. There's another possibility. It's very, very seldom executed on this planet, but it's people who knows what's going on, and they have to start off with a parable. Coming up with a parable, once you know what life's about, is easy. You just realize, well, I can't say the truth. I can't put it directly. So you go, all right, and you can just start without even knowing where you're going. You just say, there was once a sailor who got shipwrecked, and have no idea where it's going after that, but it doesn't matter. There was once a man who decided, I will change from making wine to growing kumquats. Doesn't matter. I could let you make up the first line. I mean, it made a little sense. And it just sounded strange enough I could take it from there and go with it. Because you can start off with a parable if you know what you're doing. Life's an allegory. Let's just look out there. And then the trick is not to make the circumstance of ordinary life like a novelist, I was saying. In case I got too confusing, of taking ordinary, mundane circumstances and trying in some way to push it into a parable there at the end. The other way is you start with a parable if you know what's going on, and then you think, well, how can I push it right to the end? And maybe just kind of go, ooh, look at there. In other words, be non-parabolic. So I may finish the other stories. See how many hedgehogs you can spot here. There was once a sailor, come to think of that, who spent his life exploring all of the wondrous and exotic seas the world had to offer. Then one day he found himself shipwrecked, alone on a barren island. And it was there, with nothing but himself, that he made his final grand discovery. Boy, that sounds so metaphorical. There's the only reason I was stopping to even comment, because that sounds like, well, now that we're talking serious allegory. And of course, many people would believe that they could analyze and interpret that one immediately. Well, what you're saying is a sailor, say all the wondrous and exotic seas. There'd be a man who tried to pursue all the mystical ideas, all the different religions. He tried to consider them all. He sailed all the wondrous, exotic possibilities. He'd already done it. And then one day he found himself shipwrecked on a barren island. That is, a man suddenly finds himself, if not physically alone, he feels like, I am on an island alone. The rest of this means it's nothing. It's just me. And there he sits or stands in his room. But there, by himself, no longer any courses, no longer any books, no longer any tapes of some guru, no nothing. In other words, almost no input. He's on a barren island. And it was there, finally, by himself, that he made the grand discovery. Ordinary people, especially ordinary people that thought they were a little unordinary, would go, aha. All that says is, it comes down to it finally. And if you're ever going to awaken, if you're ever going to discover the secret, it's just, you do it. Well, what a brilliant interpretation. I mean, not that you're anything over 4,000 years late. Why would I repeat the same hedgehog? No. It could be better than that. That's too easy. Ordinary weekend mystics have already come up with that one. So what could it be? There was once upon a time, a man captured a wondrous creature and put it in a box. It doesn't say, I'm guessing again. I'm going to tell you, I'm guessing. Well, as opposed to being, like the size of a refrigerator carton. There was once upon a time a man captured a wondrous creature and put it in a box. But the creature was so, it's underlined, so wondrous that it never realized it was in a box. Of course, you've got to sort of figure, well, it was so wondrous that it never realized it was in a box. How's that wondrous? Hey, if you were put in a box, would you know it? You'd go, damn right. But then you can say, well, what? You make it sound like a compliment, say the creature was so wondrous that it didn't realize it was in a box. You can say, well, it shows it's stupid. It's not wondrous. I thought we all had decided by now. Well, we took a vote. Maybe all of you weren't here that night. But calling other people in other parts of life stupid is a very, if I may say so, is a very dangerous game to ever engage in. And especially if you're convinced that something was stupid, it is past the point of just dangerous. Once upon a time, a man captured a wondrous creature and put it in a box. But the creature was so wondrous that it never realized it was in a box. And soon, somehow, even made the man forget it. I'm going to have to go ahead and point out to you that linguistically, rhetorically, there is a flaw in the sentence, if you're ordinary and sane. But the creature was so wondrous that it never realized it was in a box, comma, and soon, somehow, even made the man forget. How the two connected? That this creature that fit into this thing that was smaller than a refrigerator carton, shipping carton, that it got put in a box, but was so wondrous that it never knew it was in a box, but then after a while, even made the person who put it in the box forget it. Forget that it was in a box. Here's one that's the producer's favorite. There was once a man who had an illness. It wasn't fatal. It didn't even incapacitate him. In fact, it helped facilitate the living of his everyday life. Now you got to admit, that's some kind of illness. Maybe I pulled the wrong ones. See, I thought this had something to do with the guy that caught a creature and put it in a box, but Jesus. There was once a man who had an illness. All right, I'll admit it, I wrote it on purpose. An illness. Can anybody, we're not ever going to say the name tonight. We've been talking about money and creatures and boxes and sailors and desert islands. But remember, a barren island. I still don't think anybody got the barren island. The sailor had sailed all the wondrous, exotic, fascinating seas, but then found himself, now how about this, on a barren sea. Is that better? Does anybody recall one of my descriptions of CSC, Consciousness Sans Comment? No, I don't. Think about a man with an illness. Think about what it is that at some time, probably at least once a day, whether you use the terms or not, that ordinary men feel as though they damn near have an illness. I could have been more polite probably and said like an irritation. That'd probably be, more people would like that. But there was a man who had an illness. But it wasn't fatal. In fact, it didn't really inconvenience him much. That in fact, it assisted him in living his everyday normal life. What a damn illness. Which would you prefer, were you in the midst of any of my parables, which would you prefer, to have that currency that had nothing to back it up? Or to have that box? Yeah. To have a barren island? Or to have that kind of illness? Once upon a time, this was a two-parter. Once upon a time, a man found himself in possession of a great herd of unknown, marvelous beasts. And in following their movements, he was taken to new and exciting places. And before he was aware of it, he merged with the herd. And could no longer observe it, or could no longer study it as an outside objective observer. Once upon a time, a man found himself in possession of a great herd of unknown marvelous beasts, and in following their movements, he was taken to new and exciting places. But before he was aware of it, he began to have favorites within the herd. And soon their wondrous travels stopped. I wonder if would that let a creature out of a box, if you call it? Would that get a man off of a barren island? Mm-hmm. Better yet, would it put him on one? Mm-hmm. Or if he was on one, would it give him something to think about? And if it did, would he go, well, goddamn, after all this, here it goes again. So you're letting them all, like a cheap watercolor, you're letting all these run together. If I'd want them all to run together, I would have made it all one story. I would have combined the names. Remember the man who named his right and left brain? Those of you, I'm going to keep working on that until either you understand it or else I can actually get it out of my mouth. You remember he named his right and left brain Cornwally Del Franco and what the hell? Well, you guys never did get it. Then he decided to put it all together. And it got even more confusing. You can't hardly get out of your mouth when if you run them all together into one word. But, he pointed out, any step, no matter how small, toward greater clarity and understanding is always in order. Well, since I'd already pulled this out and did something else, but I'll read the last one of the story types. In terms of pastries, you could think of the secret, were it to be described, as coming in two varieties. The fancy, powdered, embellished, sugared, and stacked high. Like a wedding cake. What? Think about the most yucky, peeling. You people are good pastry eaters. Chocolate, sugar, cherries, everything, nuts. Just stacked high, sugared, fancied up. That's one variety of the secret, if it were you're attempting to describe it. Have you changed the subject? And then the second kind. The first kind, the fancy, powdered, embellished, sugared, and stacked high kind, and then the plain. There is, I can't resist pointing out an even tighter crack into which you might try and cram your eyesight. At first I could say, if we're looking at the description of the secret, were it to try to be described as being what I just said, the two varieties, vis-a-vis an allegory, a comparison with pastry. The fancy, embellished, sugared, powdered, all doctored up kind, and then the plain. You could, if you wanted to. It's a free damn country. You could look upon those two as being, shall we say, perhaps equitable to an allegorical description of it, and a point-blank one, the very thing we've been talking about. Right? Which is the most popular? We don't go into any place that says pastry, bakery, and if they do have anything resembling just a piece of white bread laying there or cookie, I mean, the simplest piece of dough that I guess you put a little sugar or something and you call it, something. The cheapest cookie you could make. And there it is. Is it going to be that, or you look over it that's got the chocolate eclairs and the danishes and everything? You know which is the most popular. Then I was going to say, looking at that as being the two possible description of, if they were attempted to describe what's going on in life, the secret of life, to describe it either plain or allegorical. Notice, into that which would apparently be, should have been, assumed to be the public spokesman, the public arena of the possibility of talking about things mystical, to wit religion, are there any plain forms of religious explanations of life? It's good that we're running out of time, because this gets really interesting if you want to think about it in a certain way, and it's got nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the way the mind wants to operate naturally, what it wants to hear, what it will tolerate, and you can point out what it's doing and even make the mind go, well, you're right, we should do otherwise. And you go, well, here it is. And it goes, well, no thanks. I'll try it another way. You can drag the mind, that'd be interested in something, into this pastry, into this bakery shop that says, the secret of life, the pastries that reveal the secret of life. And you go into it and you say, all right, we got two choices. We can get this plain cookie over here, I'll give that to you and I'll show you what it is, or these over here. Now you at first say, well, everybody's going to say over here, but if it's actual explanations of life, people want it more plainly. Are you sure? Is there such a thing? Now, you're going to have to jump back and forth real quick because it becomes self-consuming. But is there such a thing? Think about it as a plain, point-blank religion. At first, think about all the structures, think about the hierarchy. If nothing else, think about the buildings themselves. I point out human institutions, not just religion. It's true with government, academia, but religion. If religion was actually operationally what men say that it's supposed to be, and they're not mistaken, but what they say it should be, that this is the voice of God, or this is the voice of creation, this is the Big Bang, after all these billions of years still trying to speak to man, and religion's his mouthpiece. Nothing particular spooky about it. It's just, it could have been sports, it could have been anything, but religion seems to be it. That and a good hand gesture. Well, I'll be down. So at first you could say, no, you could agree with me, what you would probably thought I said, like, well, is there such a thing as a plain, unadorned religion? And you go, well, no, they're all fancy. They're all sugar, and then you could think, you could say, well, and you could even think I'd pointed this out before. Not only religion, but everything else. But in religion and everything, the less you know, the better be the building. You get all those B's? You know, the less you know, the fancier you should dress. The less you know, the more degrees you better have. But if nothing else, when it comes to public institutions, the less that's going on, the less power, the less efficacy there is inside. I mean, look at it. Always the king's palace. Think about that. You're so used to that, you just assume it as part of the norm. But just look at old movies, since you've never seen them. Well, films now, they show where they still have royalty sitting in Europe. And there it is, in this day and age, but you're just used to the king as sitting there on the most fantastic throne, or the pope. But kings, it could bring it down to every level. And by now you should know that people in authority normally, intellectually, are dunderheads. They simply are. A sharp wolf does not take over a pack. A sharp wolf, there was such thing, he doesn't even want to be in charge. That'd be the last thing he wants. You got the meanest, you got a Machiavellian pope, wolf, president. You got a sly man, you got a dangerous man, you got a man that would cut your throat, but that's who you want leading the pack. That's who you want leading the country, that's who you want leading the church. And it's just a fact. And so there sits kings. You can see their photographs from 100 years ago, and you can see, and there it sits, a king or a pope or somebody, and he's got, his throne costs more than all of us put together will make in a lifetime. Just the throne or the crown. And here it is sitting across his head, and it looks like one of my drawings. You can look at him, it looks like Elmer Fudd or somebody. There's nothing else. It looks like a poster boy for birth control, or, here's what incest will do for you. And there he sits. And yet he's a president of somebody. The less is going on inside, the greater must be the building. So you could say, back to my question when I said, all right, is there anything as a plain, point-blank religion? And at first you want to go, well, no, they're all real fancy, and it's probably because they don't know anything. I mean, if you're trying to throw my own words and descriptions back on me. And at first that sounds, yeah. Because they're all, if you ask some religion, the Catholic Church, any religion, Judaism, they keep on and on and on reinterpreting reinterpretations, and they got so many books nobody could begin to read them all. Same thing about every religion. It becomes more and more complicated and complex. It's this huge structure that builds up. That doesn't have anything to do with a monetary system. No, you're trying to run two things together. Listen quick. And you can say, well, you're right. There is no such thing as a simple point-blank religion. But yet inside the structures and all, what do they depend on? Nobody wants to think about it? When do they have holy books? If you think the thoughts of others, are you going to call that your thoughts? If you repeat the thoughts of others? What could be simpler than saying, well, I don't have to think about what this means. God said what it meant right here. How simple is that? You understand? That there it stands inside of some great edifice wherein you would assume they know nothing. One of the world's great religions. As I say, it could be the world of academia, but religion. And you think, well, it is so complex. If there is some valid authenticity to religion, to man's notion, then why is there not one religion, and why don't they say, all right, here is what's going on, the secret of life? Why do you go and talk to them, and they run you, I mean, it looks like not just beating one hedgehog and making it run around, it looks like the Hedgehog Olympics. I mean, it's just, they don't ever get you anywhere. You ask a question, and by the time they respond, you got 20 more. And you say, well, why don't you just come out with it and say what it is? And so you could think, well, that you're going along in line with what I was saying about the lack of any authenticity, validity, or potency intellectually inside of the human institution such as religion. You say, yeah, you're right. The number's point blank and crude. If you push them, though, it does reach within inside the structure itself, this illusionary structure, it does reach, in a sense, simplicity and bluntness. But not based upon what anybody understands. If you suddenly grabbed a priest or a rabbi or somebody and said, you're driving me crazy. I would be a Catholic or a Muslim or somebody if you would answer me one straight question. So-and-so, you ask me that one thing, I'll kill you. And they go, what? All right, you just, you never put it to me that way. No problem. And he will answer it, but on the basis of, look right here in this book. I'll be glad to answer. I'll be glad. Because he's not going to answer because he doesn't know anything. But thank God, so to speak. We got the Koran right here. We got the Old Testament. We got the baskets of Buddha right here. We got the scriptures by God. And right there it says, no. You said, Can a man actually be a good Muslim if he commits adultery? And you say, you answer me that or I'll kill you. And the mullah says, all right. He turns to such and such page in the Quran and goes, Allah said, no. Are you happy? And you think, well, they can be point blank and simple. They can. Somebody who understands the secret of life tell you the secret of life even in a roundabout way. Or, I mean, assuming that'd be pretty neat. Or to hear what God said. There ain't no contest. According to the priest or rabbi, he quoted God and he said, all right, you want a simple answer? You know, like go my throat. You just, you never asked me this way. All right, the answer is, blah, 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 turn. All right, right here. No. Do you realize we have just made all my allegories, all my parables, all my stories eat themselves? The damn wall fell down again. Instead of mud, silly putty. I got a better. Instead of using mud to actually put up a formidable, a stable brick wall, instead of just mud or even silly putty. See, what we use are your normal neural juices, which make silly putty look like good concrete. And some man's mind says, hey, you can't talk about me that way. And you go, well, I sure can. He goes, oh, well, I never think about it. I'll get back with you. Answer me one question, you damn priest. Just straight. Well, you never asked me that way. Sure, I will. No connection, right?